Cargo consultant out of Kansas City is casting serious doubts on the cargo hub that local leaders are trying to establish at Lambert. You know about the Midwest China Hub Commission? Well, in a moment, we're going to talk to Michael Weber. Mr. Weber believes, among other things, that St. Louisans have been hoodwinked. We'll discuss that next.
GC. The human brain contains over 10 billion neurons. It's on Twitter, KMOX on Facebook. It's your cortex. Use it. Stimulating your senses every day. We're News Radio 1120, KMOX. Now, you can listen to News Radio 1120 KMOX live on your Android phone. Radio.com. Download the Radio.com app today in the Android marketplace.
Hey, we're learning of a major traffic problem. Again, major traffic problem in the area. 270 east heading toward Illinois between Riverview and Bellefontaine Road. Traffic is backed up, so be careful if you're heading in that direction. Local leaders are trying to get between $300 and $400 million in tax credits to establish an international cargo hub. They say that it'll work with cargo from all over the world, although officially the name of the organization here is called the Midwest China Hub Commission. So I think most of it is directed toward the country of China. Michael Weber is a air cargo consultant based in Kansas City, and in a recent post in Air Cargo News, he says that St. Louisans are being hoodwinked. In fact, he thinks that the entire state is being hoodwinked, and he doesn't see why Kansas Cityans would be subsidizing something that could actually hurt their airport, among other things. Michael Weber, how you doing? Thanks for joining us on KMOX in St. Louis. Are you there, sir? Mr. Weber? Okay, we're having some trouble finding Mr. Weber. Maybe we'll reestablish contact and see if we can talk to him. But right now, we're getting nothing. So we'll go to Ron. Is Ron still on the line? Hey, Ron, you're on KMOX.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, just fine. Thank you very much.
I was just calling about Chuck Berry. Are we still on that topic? Thank you very much.
Oh, good. Thank you very much for taking our call today. How's everything in the Kansas City area?
We're doing just fine. And by the way, I do agree with your last caller and your commentary this morning about Chuck Berry as well. As a music lover and somebody who's not from St. Louis, you guys aren't celebrating what's wrong with Chuck Berry. You're celebrating somebody who everybody outside of St. Louis considers to be one of the best things about your city. And I'd hate to see St. Louis make the mistake that Kansas City made, and that's build a statue to Charlie Parker decades after the man's dead. So I applaud you for that.
Hey, very well. Appreciate that. Hey, let me ask you about this hub that local leaders are trying to establish at Lambert Field.
Right.
You point out in a recent column in U.S. Air Cargo News that there's no evidence at this point that people who are currently using O'Hare International Airport for their international cargo have any interest in leaving that airport.
That is correct. As a matter of fact, it's probably illustrative of the issue, how I came to be involved with this. I'm not on anybody's payroll. What happened was because I'm an air cargo consultant and based in the Midwest, I kept receiving emails from people in the industry, from carriers and forwarders and others, just asking me, what was up with this? And I have to tell you, every single time I heard about it, it was with, derision from the industry. And so that's what caused me to write the piece, and I never considered it, to be a prospect for an article or anything of the sort. I was just sort of writing a, 4-page or so, think piece on it. And, Air Cargo News, the publication, you read it and picked it up. But really, that was the basis of it. I do some consulting for Chicago. I also do consulting for LAX, for Miami, and New York. And I only bring that up because those are the 4 biggest international gateways in the country. And the more that, I started writing that piece and hearing about, what the case was that St. Louis was making for this, the more it just falls apart. And, I can go into as much detail on that as you like.
Let me just hit a couple of your points. Number one, you think that people who send cargo internationally not only want cargo flights with the mainline carriers, but they also like to use the bellies of passenger craft. And because St. Louis has no international flights, not a few, but zero,
right?
There is no second chance if you miss the cargo flight getting into the belly of a passenger craft?
Well, that's a fine summation of it, but it actually is a little bit bigger than that. You have to start with the fact that about 90% of the U.S. cargo market is now dominated by integrated carriers like FedEx, UPS, and DHL who operate freighters, but that's mostly the domestic market. The only cargo carriers in the U.S., by and large, that have been able to use these alternatives beyond their hubs, beyond the logical big cities, have been FedEx and UPS, and to a much lesser extent DHL. Even your proponents of the project in St. Louis concede that this project will have to get by without those carriers because they already have regional hubs in the area. FedEx has its second largest hub in the world in Indianapolis, and UPS has their regional hub in Rockford. They both have, global hubs in Memphis and Louisville, respectively. Those two carriers account for about 90% of the volume of cargo at St. Louis, which isn't a major market to begin with. As I point out in the paper, it's the 39th biggest cargo market in North America. And so you're going to, try to build this effort without either the two carriers that are the only ones in the U.S. that have any demonstrated history of being able to make these alternative gateways work at, the kind of level that St. Louis is talking about. And your proponents are already admitting the two carriers with a 90% market share of a very small market aren't going to be involved in this. So that moves into the international carriers that you're talking about. And to give you an example, at O'Hare, that international belly cargo, carried in the bellies of passenger planes, accounts for about 42% of international cargo at O'Hare. But it's even worse than that in terms of St. Louis's prospects. Not only are you going to be dealing without that 42% that's moving in the bellies of passenger planes, but internationally among the Asian and European carriers, and to a lesser degree the Latin American carriers, a lot of the major passenger carriers like Korean Air and Lufthansa also operate freighters. And they get a tremendous, as you can imagine, it's a lot more efficient for them to operate the freighters and the passenger aircraft in the same gateways because they're selling to the same forwarders and using the same trucking companies and other allied industries. And so not only are you going to be starting without the 42% that's carried in bellies at O'Hare, but then you're also going to lose everything, because these carriers are not going to say, well, we'll fly passenger aircraft to Chicago and fly our freighters to St. Louis. So you're starting with this huge discount between those carriers. And then on top of that, Charlie, if you've flown internationally, maybe you flew, Delta or something like that abroad, and then you picked up, a second carrier from there. Well, those are, carrier agreements, and, they do have similar relationships on the freight, on the cargo side as well. And so a lot of these carriers have, agreements between themselves for, sharing capacity, and they use, common ground handlers. Some of them lease space from one another at certain airports. And so as you start stripping away these carriers that automatically will not be part of the St. Louis equation, I think any expert who isn't on the payroll of the proponents of this project would probably come up with a likelihood of this project, being successful of something under 1%.
You also point out that while here in St. Louis, Senator Bond had a big steak luncheon with the Chinese and said, look, we're going to be selling livestock to the Chinese.
Yeah.
This was tried about 20 years ago in Kansas City, and there never proved to be any demand for Missouri livestock to be sent to China.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, for Kansas City, that livestock export facility turned out to be something of a white elephant. I think it was probably used, I know it was used under 10 times for its specific purpose. It may have been used to store snow removal equipment and stuff like that, but not for livestock. And that's because, and this should be something actually, folks in your region understand real well. With biotechnology, advances in that, as I point out in the piece, it came to the point where you could ship 100 cattle on a test tube because they ship it for fertilization purposes, shall we say, to put it delicately. And so what happens is, you do still have exports of livestock, but typically it's to create that breeding stock, and it's a very occasional demand. And you have livestock export facilities in places like Miami. But to give you a better example, Atlanta built one for the Olympics. To handle, the movement of equines. And they figured that, we'll capitalize it on the basis of the Olympics and we'll use it for exporting livestock. And again, I bet they've used it under 10 times since it was built. It was great for the Olympics, but not much beyond that.
And boy, and Atlanta's a huge city with a lot of international connections.
Well, and that's what really concerns me, too, about the St. Louis case, as I read through it. And again, I can't stress enough, because I know I've heard this from, a couple of the proponents. I am not worried about parity for Kansas City. I do happen to be Kansas City based, but I'm not a consultant for Kansas City. And frankly, if they were to negotiate a deal where they said, well, $400 million for St. Louis and $400 million for Kansas City, or we'll split it down the middle, I would still be opposed to it because it doesn't make sense in Kansas City or St. Louis. The proponents of this keep acting like there's this rush on because St. Louis has discovered China. Well, everybody in this country knows that China is a market of 1 billion people plus. Everybody is after this, and what's happening is, originally LAX was the dominant gateway for Asia, and it still is. They're not losing service to other markets, and as much as people aren't deciding we don't need to serve LAX anymore, we can, go past it. But what is happening is as the Asian carriers are growing their networks in the U.S., they're starting to go to secondary markets, but the secondary markets they're, starting to go into are not cities like St. Louis that have no international service whatsoever and rank 39th in North America in cargo. They're still developing their markets in Dallas and Houston and Atlanta, which, as you point out, these are huge markets with hubs for U.S. carriers. They're able to offer them all that network connectivity because, Delta flies, to how many cities from Atlanta, American from Dallas. They're also able to, connect with Latin America. So these Asian carriers are still adding service in places like Miami and Atlanta and Houston and DFW, and there's a tremendous amount of capacity left in those. But as I also point out, and this is where I always get very concerned, is, when you read proponents' cases that are just so easily knocked down, and you raised one of them with the livestock, but, I was reading, in one of your local, dailies there very recently, they were talking about, Chicago's just about out of capacity, and, they've just had this runaway growth. Chicago's down 6% over 10 years, so, what the runaway growth is that they're talking about, as you quoted me, I mean, they're either hoodwinking or just that ignorant about the industry, but they apparently don't know what they're talking about.
So Chicago's actually down and has capacity for more growth right now.
Absolutely. I mean, not only and they're down because the whole industry has been down. St. Louis is down 20% over that 10 years, which also makes it all the more questionable. It's not like St. Louis is on some kind of a roll. 2 years ago, St. Louis had less cargo than Des Moines, Iowa, let alone Kansas City.
Well, that's why they're trying to build this thing up, Mr.
Well,
Weaver,
I know,
right?
but airports and cities don't build hubs. Carriers and forwarders do.
Hey, we have to let you go at this point. Sure. Can I ask you just one final question?
Certainly.
You indicate that St. Louisans are talking about building millions of square feet of cargo space, but you say that UPS and FedEx, which already do this, only use about 300 to 500,000 square feet, and nowhere is millions of square feet, let alone 27 million square feet, needed.
You're absolutely right. I appreciate you bringing that up because, again, when you see the projections as wildly exaggerated as this is, you don't only smell a rat, you smell a rat that's wrapped in week-old fish paper. And, the UPS and FedEx regional hubs tend to run about 350 to 500,000 square feet. And there's an operation down in Huntsville, Alabama that serves an international freighter operation. It operates out of about 100,000 square feet at the most for something comparable to what St. Louis is talking about with 8 flights a week. So when you start talking about folks going from 100,000 square feet of proven need for warehouse space to asking for 27 million, you've got to think that this thing is really rotten. Okay, Michael Weber, we've run out of time, but I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today on KMOX. It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Have a great day. That's air cargo consultant Michael Weber out of Kansas City with us today. He is a consultant to LAX and Miami and other airports. Well, one thing that we might do is send out some of that delicious frozen custard from Ted Drew's. I don't know if it's by rail or boat or by aircraft, but I think the world is ready for it right now. However, Ted